here at Village Square Booksellers in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And this is Bellows Falls' third Friday, and we have a lot of things going on in the community. And we're honored to have an author repeat her visit after 10 years. And it's Reeve Lindbergh, who's going to talk about her newest book, Two Lives. And she has a number of children's books also. And maybe she could talk about the difference of writing biographies versus children's books and how it all goes.
I can do that. I can do that. The children's books, I guess I've written many more of those than books for adults. And I started writing children's books because I was teaching in southern Vermont. I taught in Reedsboro, Vermont for a couple of years before I had children when I first moved here. And what I found was that the children who had trouble reading reacted much better if we were working with rhyme, with books that rhymed. And I was fascinated by that because the kids who had just no interest, and many of them don't, in the well-organized reading materials established for children, would be not interested in reading that stuff. But if you gave them a Dr. Seuss book, you know, Hop on Pop, or One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, or those beautiful Margaret Wise Brown books. You know, many of you can follow. If I said in the great green room, there was a telephone and
a red balloon.
there you go. And so many children are able to jump into that. And I noticed, and I know people have written about this a lot, that they also kind of internalize the jump rope games that we've all played over the years, or marble games. There's a lot of poetry in everyday life for children, and they don't really get a lot of it in their, or they didn't at that time. And I got very interested in rhyming books for children, and that's all I've done. I started with a lullaby, The Midnight Farm, and then the next one I wrote was just a crazy rhyme called The Day the Goose Got Loose, which is probably my all-time best-selling book of any kind. That's what the kids loved it. And then it went on and on. But I really started just because I was concerned about kids not being able to read when they loved being read to. And it seemed as if there should be a way to help get through that. I'm sure there are many, many people doing many other things. There's some wonderful children's books. I've been looking as I came through the store. But for me, it was all about rhyme. And that was the children's books. And the other books that I've written for adults, more or less, I seem to write mostly memoir. I wrote about growing up with my family and long ago, and that little book was called Under a Wing. That was published in 1998. And I gave it that title because my father once said, he said in his book about the spirit of St. Louis, he talked about how nice it was when he was flying as a barnstormer to land the aircraft and sit under the shadow of the wing. He said that the farmers would come and sit with him sometimes, and they would kind of talk to him about their lives, and he had been in farming as a boy. And he said, well, what did he say? It's an interesting place under a wing, and good for business too. You talk for a while about people's lives and their farms, and pretty soon they're kind of interested in taking a ride over town. and so then he would make his money. But he really loved it. He loved the kind of interpersonal stuff. He's always been thought of as such a distant kind of person, but really he loved being with the people, the kinds of people he had grown up with, and the farms and throughout the Midwest and all over the country, and being together under a wing with somebody else talking about aviation or talking about agriculture, whatever it was. And it seemed to me that I grew up under a wing, under two wings, my mother's and my father's. And we were very sheltered in a certain way, and we were also, we had a kind of a family community. We were We were protected, but there were 5 kids, and you know, life with 5 kids is pretty active. So I thought I would title that book Under a Wing. And over the years, I've written other memoir kinds of books. I'm not a historian, but because so many historians and scholars have been interested in my family, I've gotten to know a lot of the facts and the figures and the years and the details of my family life and my parents' lives. And so it feels like sometimes like biographical work, but it's pretty much memoir, kind of what I know, what I found out, how I feel about it. And in this particular book, I was writing about just my everyday life here, and then the ways that the family history impinges upon that life or weaves into that life. And it's just kind of an interesting dance. And that's a part of what I wrote about. And otherwise, I wrote things that had nothing to do with my famous family. For instance, I'll read you a little of the very first essay, which is called 2 Lives, to explain what I'm talking about. But the next essay is called Chicken Yoga, Rooster Soup, and it's all about chickens. So it goes on like that. It's kind of a back and forth. But I'll start with 2 Lives, the title piece. I often think I live 2 lives, one in the foreground and the other in the background, each life taking its turn. I have a real or normal life in the country where my husband and I live on an old farm at the end of a dirt road. We wear comfortable clothes, write books, raise sheep and chickens, are active in community life, and welcome our children and grandchildren whenever they come to visit. There's also an entirely different Lindbergh life, which requires putting on somewhat less comfortable clothes and traveling to places away from the farm where I attend meetings and give talks, and where there are no chickens except for the kind on the menu, followed by words like cordon bleu and à la king and Kiev. In this second life, I stand up in front of groups of people and talk a little about the books I've written for children and adults, and a lot about the lives of my late parents, Charles A. and Anne Mara Lindbergh. I've spoken about my parents on college campuses and Air Force bases, in museums and libraries and schools, to children and to adults around the country for many decades. When I've finished with the meetings or the talks, I come home to Vermont, change clothes, and emerge from the limbo of travel and from my Lindbergh life. I settle down with my husband, the dogs, the sheep, and the chickens, and immerse myself in farm and community until the next time when I put on my other wardrobe again, and out I go. Maybe it's a strange way to live, coming and going and switching focus completely between one life and the other, moving from the present to the past, not even my own past, but my parents, and back again. Still, I've done this for so long that it feels like just another part of my routine, like going to the farmer's market or taking one of the dogs to the vet. One of the chief differences is that in my Lindbergh life, there are different questions to answer. Instead of, how long has she been limping? Or, do you want a bag for those? It's, what is your favorite memory of your father? Or, did your mother teach you to write? Or, what can you tell us about the Lindbergh kidnapping? Or, did your father really have other families? These questions are now so familiar that they don't trouble me much, though I can remember when some of them did. I first began to live 2 lives not long after my father's death in 1974. Before that, my father and my mother spoke for themselves if they chose to speak at all. Most of their communication with the world was done in writing. Between the 2 of them, they published more than 20 books about their lives and reflections over the years. My father rarely spoke in public during my childhood, though he had done so before I was born. He made speeches on behalf of aviation after his 1927 flight from New York to Paris. And somebody sent me a copy. It wasn't a copy, it was an actual 33 RPM record of a speech he gave in Washington, D.C. in 1927. It might have been at the press club. I can't believe it because he had so little interest in being involved with the press. But it was a 33 RPM record, and I didn't even know how I was going to listen to it. But a young man I know said, "Oh, I'll bring you a record player," and we played it, and I could hear my father, 25 years old, laughing and talking to the press and the world, and so excited about the world of aviation. And I had never known him like that. I'd seen pictures, and once in a while you'll see a film. There's a film at the Springfield Library. I went there to talk about children's books, and the librarian brought out a film of the time he landed in Vermont. He landed in 52 cities, I believe, after the flight to Paris. And he landed in Vermont, and there was a parade, and everybody was wearing a three-piece suit. Not my father. He was in his flying clothes. But these gentlemen, and you still see pictures of them, at railway crashes and all kinds of exciting events and very important occasions. But everybody is so dressed up, and I couldn't help thinking how hot it must have been. This was the summer after that flight. But I love finding little bits and pieces. And this record, not only did this young man play it for me, but he had a friend who was a real kind of tech whiz, and he was able to transfer that 33 RPM record into a little CD.
Oh.
And he gave me a bunch of copies, 6 copies, and I could send them out to my brothers and keep one. And I thought, I'm so glad. What a wonderful thing to have happen after all these years, to hear my father's voice when he was 25. That was really it was a treat. And here we go. Off we go. Anyway, when I knew him, he began to speak out again. He had spoken out about aviation. Then he spoke out before the war, when he was an isolationist, very controversial now, but there were a good many people who were worried about the U.S. entering the war at that time. And when we did enter the war, of course, he flew in the Pacific. He flew combat missions. But he was very vilified by a number of people for his position against the war, because it was felt that he was anti-Semitic. And he always said he wasn't, but I've read some of those speeches, and I can see why people thought he was. He just really didn't have a sense of what his speeches, his pre-war speeches, how they would resonate generally. And my mother told him, she said, if you make those speeches, people will say you're anti-Semitic for the rest of your life. And he said, but I'm not. And she said, it doesn't matter. It's the language. And I think that's actually very interesting, that we don't even know sometimes. We think we are saying one thing, and sometimes the words will spill into a whole world. Well, the world of anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, all those things that we definitely don't want to be involved in. And every generation has different words and vocabulary that the next generation may judge. And it certainly happened to my father. But in any case, toward the end of his life, he began to speak out about the environment, and he spoke in the House chamber in Juneau, Alaska, in support of a bill protecting Arctic wolves. He spoke on behalf of the blue whale. He spoke on behalf of wildlife preservation in East Africa, did a lot of work in that part of the world. He gave a speech in 1973 at his boyhood home in Little Falls, Minnesota, in which he reminisced about summers sleeping on the screen porch of that home not far from the banks of the upper Mississippi River. And in that part of Minnesota, the Mississippi is just little. It's just a trickle. And I never knew that until I visited that home and saw where he had grown up. I always think of the mighty Mississippi. But my father knew it as just a little river, navigable and interesting to him, and for fishing and for boating and so forth and so on. So I knew him best during this time, his conservation years, when his focus was absolute, as it always had been, on whatever project or passion engaged him. He talked about saving the monkey-eating eagle in the Philippines. and the blue whale and the wildlife of East Africa. He was so electrically energetic that even when he was away, his influence remained and reverberated throughout the house. My mother was an entirely different story. During my childhood, our father was present even in his absence. His energy, his rules, his discipline lingered in the house like the woodsy outdoor scent of his winter jacket in the hall closet. Our mother, however, could be absent within her presence. She always listened. She didn't disappear into the world for weeks or months. Still, she could go deeply into herself when I was sitting right there next to her. Her eyes would look off and away through the window over the mudflats and marsh grasses of Long Island Sound, one hand fingering a brooch at her neck. A cameo in a silver frame with a bouquet of flowers against a black background, all fashioned of tiny, colorful, semi-precious stones. I knew she was still there with me, but that she was also somewhere else. They were an interesting pair, were strong parents, and provided a great deal of protection for us all. And I never understood entirely that that they were protective. I never really got it until I was much older. I didn't know about the kidnapping and the child who died. I just thought it was so annoying that my father we used to have false surnames if we went traveling. We would go, they would take us skiing, actually up into Canada when we were kids, and we would be somewhere where they would register under a different name, and it was usually a name that sounded like one of the family names, like Scott, which was my brother Scott's actual first name, so that was confusing, or Spencer, which was a name in my mother's family, and I tended to forget what name I was supposed to have. And so if somebody said, "What's your name, little girl?" I would just throw anybody, because it was just was odd. But for them, of course, it was a protection for us. I didn't realize how much they did to just protect us. So I talk a little here about my half-siblings in Europe. My father did have other families. He did meet and have children with 3 women, two sisters, and a friend of theirs whom he met after the war. One of them was a translator, and I believe worked on his other editions of his books. And there were these children I found out about long after his death, and several years after my mother's death. There were one of the families was interested in meeting us and in kind of revealing themselves to the world. The 2 other families did not ever want the secret to be open to the world, and that was a difficulty both for them and for us. One of them contacted me and said, "This is a terrible problem. Our half-siblings would like the world to know this story, and it should be private, and our mothers never ever wanted anybody disturbed by it." And so what ended up happening is that some of my family went to visit. One of my brothers, who normally lives in Brazil, went to Europe and visited some of the people. Actually, I think he met most of the family. I did the same thing. I traveled to Europe and traveled around to the different areas, one in Germany, one in France, one in Switzerland. And I met all these people, and they were really nice people. They were a lot younger than I am. They were all born from the 50s to the 60s. They were very quiet, very intelligent, and apparently this had been an absolute secret from everybody. And these kids, they didn't even know who he was until after he had died, and they found out. So I've stayed in touch with this whole group of people. Most of them, one of them has died, as my sister has died of cancer. But that was something I have no explanation. I don't know what happened. I don't know what he was thinking or what need that served. And I don't think my mother really knew about it. She had a close friend whom I asked. It was after my mother had died and the friend was still living, and I asked her, did my mother know? And what she told me was, she knew something, but she didn't know what she knew. And that interested me. That sounds like my mother. She chose not to pursue, but that's as much as I know. And this is part of my other life. So there were two lives for a lot of us there. You know, my father apparently had more than two lives, but it's hard at this age. I'm 72 now, and I find that it's harder and harder for me to judge people or to get all upset, even at things that would have made me furious. Some things I will still be furious about. I don't like people being hurt. But when I first met one of these half-brothers, he and I took a long walk in the rain, and we were both so mad. We were so furious. He, I think, because he had not known who his father was, it was such a deep, dark secret, and also because he felt that it was just no fair to these women to have children and not be around more and not. And I, because I thought it was so really tough for my mother, and I just was in a state. And then we kind of walked ourselves out of that and became interested in each other's lives and the other people in our families. And I met his mother. I liked her very much. And that kind of set the stage for a real connection over the years. And so I've known him for now, 15 years, and we talk on the phone every maybe month or 6 weeks. And he speaks much better English than I speak French. He speaks French and German and Italian is the way all Europeans seem to. But I found this is a really interesting thing to have in my life. Not what I would have chosen, perhaps, but what an unusual thing to have this. There's a brother I never knew, a little boy who died long before I was born, and there's a brother I do get to know, and I'm not unhappy that he's in this world, and I'm very glad to know him. But it's another complication. And if I were to be upset about everything that had happened in my parents' history, I just would never stop. And life is too important for that stuff, I think. But, so I have a little something to read to you about chickens, if you'll bear with me. After the history and the drama and the excitement and the conflicts and the joys and tragedies of the family history, I have chickens here. We have kept chickens for over 40 years. Not the same chickens for the whole time, though it sometimes seems that way. There's always a bad hen, ill-tempered and ready to strike, and strike hard should you try to sneak a hand beneath her feathery breast and extract an egg from the nesting box. There's always at least one swaggering macho rooster. There are always a few ditzy pullets hiding in the barn rafters when it's time to come in at night. And there's always one gawky half-grown chick that turns out to be the prettiest hen in the whole flock. I get a lot of advice about my chickens. Sometimes they lay eggs everywhere, and sometimes they don't lay eggs at all. Some people tell me this happens because our hens are old, and some of them certainly are. But I don't believe in, getting rid of things just because they're old. This can happen to any of us, and my chickens are fairly elderly, some of them. Some of them are not. Other people tell me our hens don't get enough light in the winter months, and we should keep a light bulb burning in the barn. We would do this, except that my husband, the spoiled sport, doesn't want to burn the barn down. And there are also people who advise us to feed the hens something other than just plain layer pellets. So all I can think of is lay your eggs more frequently pellets. I keep trying. I can't tend to believe all the advice I'm given, so I start to think about doing something different with the hens when they're not laying. But then, just when I'm about to start doing it, they all start laying eggs again. They lay eggs in the nesting boxes, and they lay eggs on the floor, and they lay eggs in hidden places in the hayloft. When you're stacking bales in the barn in July, the last thing you want to have underfoot is a rotten egg from last year, unless it's a screeching hen who thinks you're a home invader. But the chickens are always give us a lot of exciting surprises. We also have some friends in town who have a half a dozen very beautiful, sleek-looking hens, but prefer not to travel with them. This well-fed flock lives in town on Summer Street, and Tom, the husband, regularly brings one of his hens to a yoga class that's held once a week in a large upstairs room of their house. It's a very small yoga class. 4 people, the teacher, and sometimes the hen. The hen, a white leghorn, struts about with dignity among the yoga mats before we begin. She looks as if she's either going to lay an egg or do an asana, but would not dream of depositing anything that would need to be cleaned up. So she's not like my hens. She's very, very dainty and dignified. So the hen and her sisters inspire our chickens when they come on vacation, sort of, to our farm. We call these beauties the Princesses of Wales, and that's because the couple who owns them, their last name is Wales. So the princesses arrive in a big cardboard box in the back of Tom's car, and when he puts them down gently one by one in our chicken room, the flock goes wild. They've never seen anything like this. "Uptown girls," Tom said once proudly. I was worried the first time they came to visit us about the influence. When I mentioned this to some friends, one of them said that she has been injected with rooster combs regularly. I guess everybody's doing it. I wonder if we could grow roosters just for people's needs, the way we keep chickens just for eggs. I wonder if we could sell rooster combs to the pharmaceutical industry and make our fortune. But most of all, I wonder about the mysteries of poultry and the workings of fate. After 40 years of keeping chickens, my husband ended up with roosters in his knees. Very silly stuff, some of it. And then I have, some of it is a little less silly. Some of it is I write about my mother and grandmother and family women who grew flowers. Right, that my grandmother had a flower garden, so did my mother and my aunt, and sometimes my sister did, though she lived in cities most of her adult life. As I work in my own garden each summer with dirt and plants and garden tools all around, I can't help thinking about other women in my family and other gardens. I can still see the sloping border of perennials at my grandmother's house in Maine. Multicolored blooms in tall spires and low blossoming clusters, pink and blue and yellow and red and lavender, running along both sides of the grassy path. The only flower from that garden whose name stuck with me at that time, was snapdragon, because I never understood how it snapped. If I plucked one flower from the stalk of pale pink or blue or yellow, and put my thumb and forefinger into an upper and a lower part of the flower and moved my fingers up and down, I could see the resemblance to a tiny, dainty, pastel finger puppet of a dragon, but it seemed far too well-bred to snap. My grandmother, Elizabeth Morrow, was like the snapdragon, a small, energetic, warm-hearted woman with very good manners, but when you looked more closely, one who had the strong will of a much more imposing creature. I remember her with affection and some clarity, though she died when I was 9 years old. Raised modestly in Cleveland, Ohio, educated at Smith College, she married Dwight Morrow, an Amherst classmate and friend of Calvin Coolidge. He became a banker at J.P. Morgan, and when Coolidge was president, he, the president, appointed Morrow to serve as ambassador to Mexico. And that was how my parents met. My father flew to Mexico at the end of his tour around the United States and met my mother there. I once saw a list of all the flowers that were ordered for that house in Maine, and it was amazing. I saw orders for 150 gladioli, choice varieties, 40 hosta, 60 larkspur, 120 petunia rosy morn, 36 hollyhocks, and more. Whew. I'm confused about the gladiolas, though. On the one hand, according to the record, my grandmother chose to have 150 gladiolas planted in her garden. On the other hand, I have always heard that my grandmother and her 2 sisters, Annie and Edith, disliked gladiolas so much that they made a lifelong pact. When one of the sisters died, the survivor or survivors would see to it that there were no gladiolas at the funeral. Aunt Edith, the youngest and last of the sisters to survive, took this obligation so much to heart that at my grandmother's funeral, Edith went around the church ripping gladiolas from all of them. And I talked about my mother's rose bushes and my aunt who used to have wild cherry in her garden in the Northwest in Ridgefield, Washington. And whenever she took her children past the area where the cherry tree was, she would quote A.E. Housman, "Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough." And then the lilacs near her house evoked Walt Whitman. "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky." My cousins remember this. They remember being quoted. They remember the flowers and the trees, but they mostly remember the poetry and just always continuing to associate those two. My mother carried a pair of clippers on walks along the roads of our suburban neighborhood, where she would frequently clip the occasional roadside branch and carry it with her. Our neighborhood roadsides were unkempt and brambly in those days, with marsh and thicket alternating, and big old houses just visible at the ends of long, winding driveways. It didn't occur to me that as she walked and clipped, my mother was pruning her neighbor's property without permission. I just thought of her as a kind of self-appointed caretaker for the local landscape. She would put a purloined branch in a tall, thin-necked vase or in a fat-bellied, dark green Chianti bottle emptied of wine and filled with water. She might set one of these on a writing desk for inspiration or on a windowsill in order to display the graceful shape of the twigs against the sky. She told me the names of the trees and shrubs that these had come from, forsythia or euonymus, always words that were hard to pronounce and easy to forget, but she didn't mind how many times I asked. I like gladiolas. I'm very glad that we have them. We don't, actually right now we don't have them, but I always liked gladiolas. I thought they were so bright. And even if they were a little gaudy, as my husband said, we can use a little gaudy in this climate. It seems outrageous that any flower so exotically colorful could bloom here in northern Vermont, and I'm very grateful to the gladiolas because they do. So don't tell my Aunt Edith. Yeah. So a little bit, I thought I might be a little bit more, go back to the airplanes, because I tend to visit those airplanes. My father's airplane and my mother's, the one he flew with my mother every year. My mother never flew in the Spirit of St. Louis. This always seemed odd to me, though I knew my father's most famous aircraft was built to hold just one person, the pilot, and there wasn't much room to spare inside that cockpit. The idea was to carry enough fuel for the flight from New York to Paris, little to spare, and to save weight in every other way. In fact, some people called the Spirit a flying gas tank, because that's pretty much what it was. It certainly wasn't designed to carry passengers. Still, in the flight log my father kept, a number of people are listed as having flown with him in that plane, usually for no longer than 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 20. Having looked into that very compact cockpit where my father's 6'2" must have been confined, I've always wondered where he put these people, on his lap? And how hard was it to fly the plane with somebody else in there with him? According to aviation legend, the Spirit of St. Louis was not an easy plane to fly, with or without passengers. I once heard a story about the creation of the flying replica, the one they made for the Jimmy Stewart film. And apparently, the people who built the replica had followed the original specifications for the aircraft very carefully and thought it was successful, but when the plane was finished, something seemed terribly wrong. The plane was unstable in the air, the test pilot reported. It shook and shuddered constantly. If the pilot allowed his attention to stray for an instant, the Spirit would go off course. What had they missed? While those responsible for construction were still pondering this, my father visited the set. He wanted to see the flying replica, In fact, he hoped to fly it. After a certain amount of discussion and concern and maybe panic, the decision was made to let him fly the plane just as it was. He knew a thing or two about the original, maybe he could figure out what was wrong. My father took off in the Spirit replica while a group of anxious people waited on the ground below. He was gone for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes. The people expected at any moment to see him bring the plane down, upset and disappointed, but he was gone for a long time before he finally brought the little plane into land. Everyone waited anxiously, and when he emerged from the cockpit, he exclaimed, "I had forgotten what a wonderful little plane that was." And then, "You got it. You got it perfectly in every detail." One more Spirit story. When he began his trip to Mexico, where he met my mother, in Washington, D.C., as he flew along, he followed his customary practice of finding his way in the U.S. using road maps and local landmarks, which is how they had to do it at that time. Landmarks such as railroad stations that bore the names of the towns he was passing over. In those days, he could simply follow railroad tracks from town to figure out where he was. When he crossed the border into Mexico, therefore, in order to confirm his route, it seemed reasonable to fly low over a railroad station. When he looked for the name of the town, he saw this word, Caballeros. Yeah. He checked the Mexican road map for the location. Strangely, he could not find any town called Caballeros at all. He then flew to the next town, found the railroad station, and discovered another sign. It too read Caballeros. My father confessed that he flew over 3 Mexican towns before he realized that Caballeros meant men's room. Despite this setback, he made his way to Mexico City, where he was greeted by enthusiastic crowds and welcomed by his host, Ambassador Morrow, and by the Morrow family, including Elizabeth, my grandmother, their son Dwight Morrow Jr., and their 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Constance, and Anne, my mother. So he taught her to fly, and by her own account, she loved it. She loved glider flying most of all, which she learned to do in San Diego with my father in 1930, and became the first licensed female glider pilot in the U.S. And if you read some of her early flying books, you realize that flying was for her a great joy. And she was also able to be a communicator. She was my father's navigator and communicator. She communicated with all the folks on the ground in the airports when there were airports. And she loved the flights over the North Pole to Asia. She wrote a book called North to the Orient about those flights. It was a great joy to know that they had those years of flying together and doing real good. And they were in their 20s, laying out the early routes for the aviation companies before anybody else had been some of those places. So certainly before anyone else had been there by air. So I love to go visit those airplanes in the Smithsonian Institution. And in my youth, when I was young, they were just part of history. They were kind of ancient and metallic, and it was kind of cool that my father had been in those airplanes. But I didn't have the sense that I do now when I go back and I look for them and I find my family there. I find it very, very nourishing and a lovely kind of thing. I love thinking that the National Air and Space Museum is my family attic. I get to see their aircraft and the things that they ate and the little, safety rafts and the shoes that my mother was given by the Eskimo families in Greenland and Iceland. She was given a beautiful pair of little boots, and they're still there in the case at the Air and Space Museum. So it's quite a joy. I used to keep the museum at arm's length, and now I'm really very, very drawn to all of that. I don't think that the years of my childhood were for my parents at all like the years when they flew over the world together in the aircraft. I love the home my family shared with my mother and father, and the life we had growing up in Connecticut, even with my father coming and going, and even though the times when he was home were full of unexpected excitements and disturbances. But all the same, when I think about it now as an adult, when I think about them, I understand why my brother Lan once said thoughtfully, long after both of our parents had died, they never should have stopped flying. So, I think I'll stop there. I just thought if maybe you'd have some questions or some things you'd like to say or any of that. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's a great bookstore. Yes, in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Bree?
Yeah.
I didn't know I was ever going to meet you, but I worked at the Smithsonian
You
Archives.
did. Oh, that's
when
wonderful.
The building, when the plane was in the red brick building, the Arts and Industries building.
That's where
and
I saw
every
it
day
first.
I walked under that to go to work.
You were right
Every
under
single day.
Oh, that is fun. And it was so close. I mean, when I first
Yeah.
saw that plane, it was in the red brick building,
Yeah.
and you could practically touch it.
I know. I was right there.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. That's
Fate, you
terrific.
just never know.
No, isn't that something? The first time I saw it, it was there, and then over the years, of course, I saw it in the Gallery of Flight, I guess it is. And they are doing some massive renovations, I gather. Yeah, they're doing now, and they have, of course, they continue to do that. But I remember at one point when I think I've written this, so if you've read it, pardon me, but I love this story because it's very much the way I was. When I took my son Ben, when he was 10, he's now in his 30s, but when I took him to the Air and Space Museum for the first time, they were doing some repairs and renovations and things, and there happened to be a big a cherry picker near the aircraft, and we were told that if we came early to before the place was open, that they would let us get into the cherry picker and go right up next to the airplane, which I had never done. I'd never been, that's the only time I've ever been that close. So we did. We got, Ben was 10 years old, the deputy director came down and helped us get into this cherry picker, and we went right up next to the aircraft, and I was able, they let me put my hand on the cockpit door, and I was in tears. I had never been this close. And I turned to my son, Ben, and I said, "Isn't this wonderful?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I've never been in a cherry picker before." I thought of all the things he could have said. Probably my father would have liked that best. But anyway, so this is it. There's some chickens, and there's some thoughts about here and now, and there's a bit about the things that come to me because of my family history. A long piece about having to research the archives because somebody had written a song, a lovely song about the spirit of St. Louis, and they had not. It was just it was a high school music teacher, and he wanted to create something that his kids could sing, and it was I think it was in St. Louis, I believe that's right. And then somebody got hold of it and thought, we could market this, and which is fine. And then they came to me and said, "Can we have permission to reproduce this?" And I said, "Well, you can have permission as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not sure we own the rights." Because my father, of course, had sold the book to Scribner's, and then Scribner's sold the rights to Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers, I'm forgetting who they got eaten up by, but in any case, we had to work and work and work to figure out who these rights belonged to, and they absolutely did not belong to us. But I spent a winter on this, working with an agent and going through every
Wow.
I mean, not every day, not all the time, but I had forgotten. I went through old contracts, and there were some wonderful letters back and forth between my father and the movie makers, and that was fun. But I thought, what am I doing? Swimming through all these you probably could have helped me a lot.
But you learned a lot.
I learned quite a bit. I learned things I never expected to. But and there's some,
Your story is a story of lots of different places. I mean, there's
yes.
Minnesota, there's Connecticut, there's
That's right.
Hawaii was very important to your family.
That's right.
Mexico, the whole your mother's family, particularly in Mexico,
Haven,
and so on.
Okay.
Your adult life has primarily been in Vermont.
It is.
Talk about places and what attracts you to Vermont.
Well, I came to Vermont right out of college, just as a teacher. As I said, I taught in Reedsboro, And I loved it. I had only been here on those family ski vacations when I forgot my name and things like that. But coming up here was extremely appealing. I think it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. And I loved the people. I loved the children. I loved the communities. And in fact, my parents came to visit us, and quite a lot. And at the end of her life, my mother was very content to be in this place. It reminded her, to a great extent, of her summers over the years. She spent many summers in a little chalet in Switzerland, and loved that farm life as it was then. It was very unspoiled. And when she came here, she felt that the hills and the small communities reminded her of Switzerland, and that the character of the people was similar. I'm sure you don't feel as if you are Swiss, but she said there's a strength and an integrity to the people here that appealed to her greatly. And at the very end of her life, things were a little confused. She had several strokes, and things were a little confused, and she would sometimes look out the window of the little house that was built on our farm that she lived in, that was quite a bit like the little chalet in Switzerland, and had her furniture from Switzerland in it. It was brought back. And she would look out and she would say, "Where are the Alps?" And she thought I'd hidden them. You know? She would look at me and say, "Where are the Alps?" And that was all that was missing, I think, for her. But this was also very attractive to my father, because it reminded him, when he flew, as he did, out of the Berlin airport. He flew with my first husband, Richard Brown, who was a wonderful photographer. And when they flew, he said it was like his first days of flying over the forests and the farmlands, which he writes about actually in the very first paragraph of The Spirit of St. Louis. He writes about flying over farmland. But he loved it because it brought him back to those early days. In fact, his last flights as a pilot were taken over Vermont, out of Berlin Airport. But I think there's a settling quality to it, or there was for us, because nobody bothered him. You know, he didn't have any of that kind of attention that he tended to get in cities, or even sometimes in the Connecticut area where we grew up. Not so much, they were pretty good. But he did not have to be in disguise. My father used to wear glasses with no lenses. You know, I mean, the lenses were in there, but they were glass, and a hat. And in Switzerland and Europe, he would sometimes wear a beret. And my father at 6'2" with a beret, he just looked not like a French person or a European. He just looked like a Minnesotan with a beret. But he had none of that unpleasant attention. People just treated him as a person.
Did he find that to be the case in Hawaii as well?
Hawaii as well, yes. it's funny because he didn't think he'd like Hawaii. He was invited to stay with a friend, and he fell in love with Maui, Hawaii, where there was a little area that was completely untouched, and that was actually where he died. So he loved those parts of the world that he felt he could be comfortable with the people, and he wasn't treated like an alien. He loved that. And that was true of Vermont and of Hawaii.
When you were growing up, your parents never spoke about the kidnapping, or
They never spoke about the kidnapping. They didn't. I mean, my father didn't speak about the flight. If I asked him questions about the flight, he would say, "Read my book." I spent all those years writing a book. All you have to do is read my book.
Yeah.
And they did not talk much about the past. But I had a child who died, and a little boy, and my mother then spoke to me very openly, and I think that was a kind of a gift that she was able to speak to me about that. But they tended not to speak about the past.
That's interesting.
They wrote about it, they wrote, and she
Yeah.
published many diaries and so on. I guess it was a way of saying you can read our books, but you
Yeah.
don't, we're living now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're,
Right. My grandmother and great-grandmother owned a place in Maine,
They did.
yeah, where your father would stay down by the boat to go over to North Haven.
That's right.
But your mother would take the kids, I don't know if you were one of them or not, to my grandmother's place, we called the Copper Kettle.
Oh,
And you would eat, and then they'd have somebody take him sandwiches down by the boat, because he didn't want to leave the boat.
he didn't want to
He
leave the
didn't
boat,
like-
of
he
course.
didn't- right.
Yeah, that sounds just
And
like
I
him.
said,
Yeah.
really? And they go, yeah. So do
Yeah.
you still have your place?
So I have nothing. I mean, our family. My grandmother had the place. The grandmother with the garden
Right.
had the place on on Deacon Brown's Point, a little point at the end of the island of North Haven, and she had a smaller house that was built for my Aunt Elizabeth while she was living. And then after she died, they kept it as a guest house, and it now belongs to one of my cousins, who has always invited the rest of the family,
Right.
all the cousins, to come in the summer, and so we do. So
It was beautiful up
it's
there.
it's just
Yeah.
a lovely part of the world. I'm very attached
Oh, yeah, I am
to
from that
Maine.
area.
Yeah,
I'm
you're
always
from
up
that.
there all
Yeah,
summer.
that's a, yeah. It's hard to choose between Maine and Vermont. I don't think we have to.
A little bit of each.
No. Little bit of each is nice. That's very true. So, thank you. Anybody else?
Anything else?
Terrific.
Thank
It's a
you.
nice group. No, I thought I better not do that. And sometimes I'll look at this is a small book, but sometimes I'll look and think, boy, you go on and on and on. So just anything you don't want to read, just skip it. Just-